Greetings, this is Greg. It's time to talk about the aerodynamic advantages of the P-51 Mustang. Conventional wisdom is that due to a laminar flow wing and a Meredith effect radiator housing producing thrust, the Mustang's aerodynamics were far ahead of everything else. That's the conventional thinking. Let's see if it stands up to scrutiny. If you're new to this channel, you might want to watch my Messerschmitt 262 versus P-80 drag video before this one. There are several variants of the P-51 Mustang, and it makes sense to start with the P-51A. The A model uses the Allison engine and is slightly faster per horsepower than the Merlin-powered P-51. For example, the P-51A does 370 miles per hour at sea level with its 1430 horsepower Allison. The 51B reaches about 360 miles per hour on 1450 horsepower. So most test results show that the earlier model is about 10 miles per hour faster at sea level on slightly less horsepower. That does not mean that the A is generally the faster airplane. Later Merlin-powered variants had more horsepower than the Allison and a lot more at high altitudes. For drag comparisons to the P-51A, we're going to be using the Messerschmitt Bf109 F4. The F series was a near total redesign of the 109 and was, for all practical purposes, a new airplane. Compared with the previous E model, the F had upgraded wings, a new engine variant, new cooling system, many changes to the fuselage, and a new cantilevered tail. Both planes faced each other over Europe, and both are powered by liquid-cooled V12s, and they entered service within about a year of each other, so the comparison is reasonable. The P-51 does indeed have very low drag, but why? Whenever people talk about the P-51, they often bring up the laminar flow wing, yet very often they don't even know what laminar flow is, so let's start there. Here's the definition of laminar flow from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says it's a, quote, type of fluid flow, gas or liquid, in which the fluid travels smoothly or in regular paths, in contrast to turbulent flow, in which the fluid undergoes irregular fluctuations and mixing, unquote. Here's a picture to help. When airflow is laminar, all the little bits of air flow along with each other smoothly and generally in parallel paths with no turbulence. Laminar flow reduces drag, and thus, in terms of aircraft design, it's highly desirable. So how do we know that the P-51 has a laminar flow wing? Now, I know it says it does in every single book and article about this airplane, but examination of these writings often shows that they're all listing each other as sources in a rather circular fashion. I just don't think that that's good enough. I want to read this from some sort of official source and hopefully an original source from the period, and it turns out we do have that. If we take a look at the P-51 manual, we do find a clear reference to laminar flow. It says, quote, the airfoil is of laminar flow design, unquote. Notice that it doesn't exactly say that the wing has laminar flow, but rather that it's an airfoil of laminar flow design. Now, that's not accidental wording. It's specific, and it's used in different P-51 manuals, as seen in the later manual here. So it's time to dig into the NACA reports. There is no report available specifically on the P-51's wing. That could be because it was co-developed with North American and maybe they couldn't release some of the data, or it could be that it just hasn't been scanned in and put up on the NASA website yet. In any case, we do have a report from 1940 on a very similar wing. This is the NACA 45-125 wing. The P-51 uses the 45-100. As a side note, the later P-51H uses a different wing. It's really a different airplane. It's the NACA 60 series wing. The same design is used on the P-63 King Cobra, A-26 Invader, and the P-80 Shooting Star. We're going to focus on the wing used in the P-51A through D, the 45-100. The 45-125 wing is very similar, the -125 design being a bit thicker. So is the 45-125 a laminar flow wing? NASA found, correction, it was NACA at the time, found that in their testing, this design could achieve laminar flow over 40% of its surface. You can see that at the bottom of this page here. Now, 40% doesn't sound bad, but at what percentage is there enough laminar flow to call it a laminar flow wing? Many wings have laminar flow at least to some extent, maybe only 1%, maybe 10%. If we want to agree that 40% is the minimum for calling a wing laminar flow, okay, I'm good with that. The 51's design was probably even a little bit better in this regard because the wing was thinner, but I'm speculating there. So the real question is this: does a laminar flow design translate into a wing that actually has laminar flow once it's in mass production and on an actual aircraft? Well, it turns out that no, it doesn't. So while the P-51's wing is absolutely a laminar flow design, that doesn't mean that it actually has laminar flow, and in fact, it really doesn't. Let's open up Quest for Performance. My longtime viewers know that I tend to use official sources like stuff from NACA, NASA, manufacturers' data. This is no exception. You can pick up this near 600-page book as a free download on NASA's site. Various places will try and charge you money for it if you just search for it on the internet, but don't fall for that. Now, when I say it's free, I mean free as in U.S. citizens already paid for it via taxes, and anyone can download it. Not free as in paid for by pixie dust and fairy sprinkles. I only mention that because I see the word free being misunderstood a lot these days. So, what does this book from NASA say about the Mustang's laminar flow wing? They say it's doubtful that any significant laminar flow was achieved on production versions. Now, while you're getting your free copy of that book, you should also grab yourself a copy of Wind and Beyond. Again, it's free and it's tremendous. This book has a section on this topic as well. It seems that the requirements to get laminar flow on a wing are so precise that while NACA could manage to do it in a wind tunnel, making it happen in a plane subjected to the realities of mass production, not to mention an actual war, wasn't realistic. Interestingly, the British were the first to point this out, and it turned out they were correct. The P-51's low drag is not due to laminar flow. NASA has been very clear about that in their books. There are multiple references in both of these NASA books, that make it clear that the P-51 has either no laminar flow or so little that it didn't really matter. What about the thrust-producing radiator assembly? I wish I had a nickel for every time someone brought this one up. There is an effect called the Meredith effect. You can look it up for a more accurate description, but here's the gist of it as it relates to this subject. Air enters a duct where it then passes through a radiator and heats up. The heated air then expands and exits at the rear at an increased velocity. Now, if the thrust from the exhausted air is greater than the aerodynamic drag from the entire assembly, then you have a net gain, meaning you have thrust adding to your speed. Now, does the P-51 have a Meredith effect cooling system? Yes, it does, and so do many other World War II fighters, including the Hawker Hurricane, Supermarine Spitfire, various Soviet planes, and yes, the Bf-109. This was not something at all new or unique to the P-51. However, the P-51's design team worked extra hard on it, and their system is very clever. It houses the radiator, intercooler heat exchanger, and oil cooler, so there's a lot of heat there to take advantage of. North American put a lot of effort into the design, but the question is, does it add a net benefit or does it just offset some of the cooling system drag? Now, this one is really tough to answer. First of all, there are several versions of this thing. NACA did do an exhaustive study of the drag of an XP-51, that's an early experimental model, in every variable tested, small scale, full scale, different speeds. It showed some increase in drag, thus no net thrust. Of course, again, this is an XP-51, and there were several changes even just during the production run of the P-51A. So I can't find solid evidence of this radiator assembly actually producing usable thrust. It's possible that some versions did, or at least did within certain speed ranges, or maybe certain speeds and certain outlet shutter openings. In Evolution of Design, it says that the radiator was designed to produce a net thrust, but it does not go so far as to say that it actually did. Either way, it's clear that as a minimum, the P-51's cooling system drag was very low, although the idea that it actually put out thrust is certainly questionable. The 109's radiator ducting was not nearly as efficient. However, the 109F's outlet shutters were automatically controlled by a thermostat, so they only opened enough for proper cooling, thus minimizing drag. In the 51A, they had to be manually controlled, so unless the Mustang pilot was right on top of that, the P-51's cooling drag advantage would be reduced somewhat in battle conditions. Of course, later P-51s went with automatic thermostatically controlled setups like the 109. So if the P-51 doesn't have a laminar flow wing and the radiator produces zero or at best very little thrust, why is the plane so fast? Well, the designers put a lot of effort into keeping drag, specifically parasite drag, to a minimum. Laminar flow or not, it still has a low drag, high speed design wing. The radiator drag is very low, and the entire airplane was built with attention to detail. For example, both main landing gear and tail wheel are fully enclosed when retracted. The gun ports are a minimum drag design, and the overall fit and finish of the airplane was very good in comparison with other fighters from the era. The P-51 manufacturer didn't have to deal with labor issues, material shortages, or air raids, or any other inconveniences of war on anywhere near the scale the Germans did, and that gave them a big advantage. As pointed out in this quote here, quality of manufacturing was a big factor in the P-51's performance. The first part of this, which you can't see because it was on another page, makes the case that the Spitfire, if built with the same level of attention to detail, which of course it wasn't, but if it was, would be about equal in parasite drag to the P-51. Of course, the Spitfire is smaller, so even if with equal drag, the P-51 design still gets a lot of credit. Now, the P-51's design and manufacturing paid off in a very low zero-lift drag coefficient. As you can see on this chart, it's under 0.017. The published numbers for the 109, for comparison, vary quite a bit, but they seem to be in the 0.027 to 0.031 range, so much higher zero-lift drag coefficients for the 109 than the P-51, and a lot of people look at these numbers without much understanding of them and conclude, based on these two numbers, that the 109 has much higher drag. However, that's not really the way these numbers work. There is a section in Evolution of Design explaining this, but the simple version is that the number relates to how aerodynamically clean a design is, not directly to total drag. Let me make sense of that. First of all, it doesn't take into account induced drag at all, and second, it's taking into account the size of the airplane. So let me throw an example out there to help clarify this. I'll go with an extreme example because that'll really drive the point home. Here is a Fokker Eindecker. This plane has the worst zero-lift drag coefficient of any plane in the book, and the book has a lot of data for a lot of planes. It's 0.0771, and it has the equivalent amount of parasite drag to a flat plate with 12.61 square feet. I know you don't have a lot to compare to yet, but trust me, these are really poor numbers. Now let's compare it to an airplane that very obviously has more drag than the Eindecker. I've been wanting to find a way to mention this plane for a while, so here it is, the Dornier Flying Boat. Its zero-lift drag coefficient is 0.0472, much better than the Eindecker's 0.0771. However, because it's so much larger, its parasite drag is equivalent to a flat plate with over 228 square feet, far more than the Eindecker's 12.61. So this is a clear case of a plane with a better drag coefficient number having far more drag because of its size. And of course, that's not including induced drag, which would be many times greater for the flying boat. Now back to the 109 and P-51. Yes, the P-51's number is better, but it's a bigger plane. For a decent comparison, we need to make a drag chart like this sample, but specific for the planes in question. Let's take a look at the 109F. The windshield is very blunt. The main gear isn't fully enclosed, neither is the tail wheel. The wing really isn't a high-speed design, but all wings involve some compromise, and the 109's wing is efficient at low speeds. The main thing that the 109 has going for it in terms of drag is the fact that it's small. That helps with parasite drag, and the low weight and lower speed wing design help with induced drag. It's time to plot the drag data and look at comparative numbers for these two airplanes, starting with the P-51. As usual, choosing the data to use is a bit tricky. They continued to increase the power of these planes, and they made other improvements over the production run. Now, there are various tests for the A model, and top speeds at sea level in these tests range from a low of about 360 to a high of about 378 miles per hour. The 360 miles per hour number comes from a test of a plane equipped with 4 20mm cannons. That was a relatively uncommon configuration for this airplane. Most had 4 50 caliber machine guns, which were much smaller. The 378 mile per hour number comes from a test in which the plane was sanded down for a little extra speed. It had a 1430 horsepower engine. After looking at the various tests, I'm settling on 370 miles per hour with 1430 horsepower at sea level for this airplane, which I think is very realistic. If you saw my 262 versus P80 video, you probably have a good idea of how we can figure out the drag numbers. However, since this time we don't have a jet engine rated in pounds of thrust, we have to convert the horsepower number into pounds of drag at the airplane's top speed. And there are two complications. First, there's some exhaust thrust adding to the equation, and no solid data for it. So what I'm going to do here is take data from an early Spitfire test and scale it up for the extra power, thus adding 100 horsepower to the 1430 we already have. Now we have to factor in propeller efficiency, and again we don't have solid data, but Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators says that 85 to 88% efficiency is what we can expect. I'm going to give the Mustang propeller design team the benefit of the doubt here and call it 88%. Furthermore, I'm going to assume that it has that 88% when the plane is at its top speed at sea level. A lot of assumptions, I know, but I do have a plan to check the accuracy of the guesswork. So, our 1430 plus 100 plus, correction, times 88% gives us 1,346 horsepower. Now, you could argue that I should have added in that 100 after factoring in the propeller efficiency, as it's clearly unaffected by it. However, I didn't, and the difference is essentially negligible. Back to the Navy's book, you may remember the formula for converting drag to horsepower. We switch it around to convert the other way, and our 1,346 horsepower gives us 1,360 pounds of drag. The way we get that is take the horsepower of 1346, multiply it by 325, and divide it by the speed in knots. Or, if you prefer, you can do it in miles per hour, since 325 knots is 374 miles per hour. In that case, multiply the 1346 horsepower by 374, divide it by 370, which is the aircraft top speed. Either way, you get 1358 to 1361 pounds of drag, depending on how you round the conversion factors. Now, we need to figure out how much of that drag is induced and how much of it is parasite. We can do that if we can find the plane's speed for L over D max. One way to do that for a propeller-driven airplane is to find the speed for maximum range. In the P-51A, that's 185 miles per hour. Pretty high speed for max range, which, as we'll see, reflects the plane's high-speed design. Now, since we know the parasite and induced drag lines will cross at 185 miles per hour, we can fill in the entire drag chart, as we learned to do in a previous video. Before we compare this to the 109's drag chart, let's make sure the numbers are correct. We did have to make a few assumptions to get here, so it's essential that we make sure we're at least in the ballpark. back to evolution of flight, and we find that this NASA book says that the P-51 has 3.57 square feet of frontal area, or has the equivalent drag of a plate, 3.57 square feet, I guess is a better way to say it. Thus, 3.57 is the number we're going to use, and we're going to put that into an online engineering calculator and see how much drag that would have at 370 miles per hour. We get 1,302 pounds of drag. We need to compare that to our parasite drag, which is 1,280. So our chart is within 1.7% of the data provided by NASA. I think that's pretty good, since there are variables here we can't really account for. And actually, we don't even know what version of the P-51 that 3.57 number represents. But I do think it's an A or a B model, as they used a slightly higher number specifically for the later D models. So let's take a look at the 109F's drag. Test results are all over the place for this airplane, at least partially because many of the tests are Allied tests done on crash repaired or captured airplanes. There is a German test on curfirst.org, an excellent site for finding research material for German aircraft. And it gives 523 kph on 1,165 metric horsepower. So that's the test I'm using. Now those numbers convert to 325 miles per hour on 1,150 horsepower. I need to clarify something, and this is important. I'm trying to compare the drag of these two airplanes, not the speeds. The speed comparison in this case is biased in favor of the P-51 because we have data for it at all altitudes at war emergency power, and that's what I'm using. The 109's numbers are generally given at climb power. Now I could estimate the 109's speeds at higher power settings, but for the sake of accuracy in terms of drag, which is the point of this video, I'm using speeds and horsepower numbers straight from the German results, and those are at climb power. Still, as you'll see, the 109 does pretty well here. Finding the best L/D speed is always a problem, especially with German airplanes, but I did find the best glide speeds for the heavier 109 G6 model, and as you probably know from the previous video, best glide also happens at best L/D. So these speeds work out to 124 to 143 miles per hour. I factored in the 109F's lower rate, and I came up with 130 miles per hour for a typically loaded 109F, meaning no drop tanks, no extra weight, just fuel and ammo and a pilot. So that's all we need to fill in the graph, so here it is. The low speed for the best L/D really shifts the lower drag areas of the chart into the lower speed range. However, that costs it at higher speeds. So I'll merge these two charts together. I changed the colors to make it a little more simple. The red lines are induced and parasite drag for the 109, and the blue lines are the equivalents for the P-51, and you can see how much farther to the right they are for the P-51. Now, it's quite remarkable that the much larger P-51 has lower parasite drag, and of course that pays off at higher speeds. That shows just how good the P-51 design and construction was in terms of minimizing parasite drag. At 370 miles per hour, the smaller 109 has about 18% more drag. And that combined with the P-51's greater horsepower translates into a much higher top speed at sea level for the P-51, regardless of the 109's power setting. At climb power, the 109 can reach 325 miles per hour, but even at maximum power can't come close to the P-51's top speed. However, once again, no free lunch, and the P-51 suffers quite a bit at the low end of the speed range, and you'll see why that matters soon. At speeds below about 240 miles per hour, the 109 has less drag, and that affects performance down at those speeds. At 150 miles per hour, the Mustang's relatively high induced drag is really starting to factor in. What's not immediately obvious is how this is going to play out at higher altitudes. For example, at sea level, clearly the P-51 has a huge advantage in top speed, 370 miles per hour versus 325. Not only does the P-51 have less total drag at these high speeds, it has more horsepower. Now let's look at higher altitudes. Going back to the 109 data, we convert numbers to feet and miles per hour. At about 13,000 feet, the 109F will reach 380 miles per hour with 1,234 horsepower. That's a true airspeed of 380 miles per hour. Of course, the air is thinner up there, so the calibrated airspeed is going to be much lower, and it's the calibrated airspeed that matters in terms of drag because that represents how much air the plane is actually pushing through. Calibrated airspeed in these conditions is only 311 miles per hour. I'm using the terms calibrated and indicated interchangeably here. So how does the 109's drag look at 311 miles per hour? Well, it's not great, but the gap is closing between the P-51's total drag line in blue and the 109's in black. Of course, the P-51 still has less drag here, and it can reach 396 miles per hour, so in this case it's still a bit faster. But let's climb higher. At 20,000 feet, the 109F can reach 395 miles per hour with 1,050 horsepower. Its indicated speed will be about 288 miles per hour. The P-51 speed is nearly identical, just slightly slower at 393. In any case, with both planes indicating about 288, the P-51 will still have less drag, but that's offset up here by the 109's greater horsepower. Now, the higher we climb, the lower the indicated airspeed for a given true airspeed. Thus, at some point, the 109 will actually have less total drag when at maximum speed than the P-51. Let's take a look at 30,000 feet, which is probably higher than either one of these airplanes would routinely fight, but still within their capabilities. Up here, the P-51 can still manage 360 miles per hour, but indicated speed is down to 220. At this speed, the 109F actually has less total drag. Furthermore, it's going to run circles around the P-51 because it has so much less induced drag. When turning, the 51 will suffer from a much larger increase in drag than the 109, and with less power available to deal with it, the 51A just can't perform with the 109F4 at this altitude. Of course, it wasn't meant to, but this illustrates the way that altitude affects drag at an aircraft's top speed. So to summarize, the P-51 Mustang does have very low drag, but it's not due to laminar flow. People need to stop saying that. The 109F isn't as high drag as people seem to think. When it's at its maximum speed, at 20,000 feet or above, its drag numbers are actually pretty good. This is partially due to the aircraft's small size and mostly due to its low induced drag. It will also benefit from the lower induced drag in any situation when it's turning, at least as compared to a P-51. Low induced drag helps sustain turn rates. I haven't worked out all the details on the later models of 109s, but it seems very clear that the subsequent 109G series had quite a bit more drag than the 109F. I'm basing that on the power required to reach a given speed. They constantly added little blisters and bumps to fit larger weapons, larger wheels, and so on. This really did a lot to offset the increased power of the newer engines. However, the reports on the G models vary, and it's going to take me some time to sort out the specifics. I might do that in a later video. Now, the 109K4 model had a lot of this cleaned up, and as of this moment anyway, I'm going to say that the parasite drag of the F4 and the K4 are actually pretty close to each other. At least that's how it looks to me in a preliminary quick look at it. That's all I have for now. This video has already run on pretty long, so hope to see everybody here for the next video, and I sincerely hope you're having a good day. Goodbye.